Anxiety with welcome everyone to the NF Network webinar. Anxiety with neurofibromatosis. Coping is better. Coping is good. Prevention is better. It's presented tonight by Brandon Tesser. He is a licensed therapist, a former educator, and a national presenter. He and his collaborators at Effective Artistry, the therapy and coaching practice he founded and now runs, specialize in the work surrounding neurodiversity and executive functioning. As a neurodivergent person with executive functioning struggles himself, Brandon is committed to helping institutions and individuals understand how these concepts impact their daily lives. I would like to thank everyone who's helped prepare for this webinar tonight. Rosemary Anderson, Zoe Verdon, Brianna Branunsky, Stutzman, and Deb Potter. We are very privileged to have Brandon with us tonight. Brandon, thank you so very much for sharing your time with us this evening.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. Sorry, I'm like adjusting my hair. It was bothering me. I had long hair when I was young and regrew it during the pandemic, and I love it, but sometimes it still gets to me. No, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here with everybody. There's a lot of us, which is exciting and a little anxiety inducing. Apropos.
Do fine.
Yeah. No, this is, I really appreciate the opportunity, and I enjoyed, I was talking to Zoe about this the other day. I like to meet with, I'm saying this for the attendees, I like to meet with people beforehand so that I can always come up with something specific for the group that I'm talking to. So Kim, when you and I and Rosemary and Brianna and everybody met a few weeks ago, was a great conversation. And frankly, I'm learning a lot because I am not an expert on NF. And I'm just going to say that up front, that I'm an expert on anxiety. We're going to talk about how NF affects anxiety and how anxiety affects NF back and forth, but mostly approaching it from that side. Yeah, I like to make things new, and it's always fun to meet new people and get a sense of a new community's concerns. So having said all that, I do like to make things different every time. I think it's kind of boring for me, and I assume for attendees too, if I just do the same thing every time I do a presentation that's not unique. And the nice thing about that is I got a lot of stuff to talk about, and the terrible thing about that is I've got a lot of stuff to talk about. So you might notice I talk a little bit fast sometimes. I'm trying to fit a lot of stuff in. Zoe is going to be here monitoring the chat. I can't pay attention to the chat because I'm way too interested in everything anybody here would have to say, and I would be constantly distracted. So Zoe's going to watch it for me, and she'll jump in and interrupt and share things as they come across, things that seem like they might be helpful for us to discuss all together. Please push her to interrupt me, push her to tell me if I'm talking too fast. And I also want to tell everybody, we'll discuss the specifics of this as we go along, but you're not supposed to hear everything. You're not going to hear everything. Nobody is going to, even if I wasn't moving very fast, you're not going to hear every word. I don't like to just give one thing, say, here's a concept that I think might be helpful, and I'll share it for an hour. The nice thing about doing it that way is if it's helpful, we can get a lot in depth and be really clear about that one topic. But if it's not helpful, then it's a waste of your time. So instead, I give as much as I can fit, including at the end of this, we'll do a Q&A, as much as we have time for. Because yeah, if I try and say 100 things in 60 minutes, you're only going to take away 6 of them, but your brain gets to determine which 6 seem most valuable, most worth paying attention to and remembering, as opposed to just the one. So I'm saying all this up front, mostly to deal with our anxiety, my anxiety right now, and you guys who are here. Because if we all check in with ourselves, there might be, not everybody, but there might be a little bit of that, right? Will he address the things that I'm concerned about? Will I get something out of this? All of you are here because presumably you're dealing with anxiety, either in yourself or in somebody that you care about and are trying to help. And so there's stakes here. There's hope that there's going to be something here that makes something better. There's worry that it will just be another thing that doesn't fit for you. I know when you're different, and having neurofibromatosis obviously is a significant way of being different from other people, that the things that are put out there aren't always relevant and applicable to you. I'm nervous because, I don't know, what if I talk too fast? What if people think I'm a weirdo? What if I disappoint everybody? We're thinking about all these things. And I have a slideshow here that I'm going to put up and take down as we go along. My slides are just generally not super full of information. They're more to help keep me on track, because otherwise I go all over the place. So sometimes I'll put them up and sometimes I'll put them down. And I'm going to do this one first. So just to model what we're talking about right off the top, for me to reduce my anxiety and help you guys to reduce any anxiety you're feeling about this tonight, right now, we're going to talk about what's coming, because anxiety is future focused and it's about uncertainty, and we'll get to all that. But getting a bit of a framework so that we have a sense of how this is going to go makes it so that it's not quite as nerve-wracking, right? So tonight we're going to start by talking about anxiety. We're going to talk about various different ways that the word is used, because it is one of those words. It's not like table where we can point to something and say, this is what it is. It's abstract. We're talking about and sharing experiences. And so it means a little bit different of a thing to every different person that uses it. But we're definitely going to talk about the more common, like categorical, the ways in which it's most commonly used. And then we'll specifically focus in on one particular way of looking at anxiety that I find to be helpful. And I'll say right now that my goal is never to take away something that somebody has found helpful. Anything that I'm talking about is an additional option. It's not to say any other way of looking at anxiety or any other method of dealing with it is bad or invalid. Anything that works for you works. What I'm trying to do is offer new and different things so that for those of you who haven't been able to find something that works, here's a new thing to try. So we'll talk about anxiety, what it is generally. We'll talk about specifically what happens when you get diagnosed with NF in terms of anxiety. And I'll say again, we're not going to talk so much about the biological elements of that, but more about how the experience of anxiety, how frequently it happens to you, how badly it feels when it does happen, is impacted by that process. Then we're going to talk about some coping strategies. You know, when you're feeling anxious, what can you do so that things can get a little bit better? And then we'll talk about what are things that you can do to make it so that you don't get anxious as frequently as you have been. And then at the end, we'll have time for questions and answers. And I am also going to catch myself like I just did constantly, because I was about to say, any questions about that? Because usually, you know, I'm in a room where I can see hands go up, and that's not the case here. So just, you know, humor me if I say anything like that. So let's talk about anxiety. What do we mean when we use the word? You know what? I'm going to actually share that still.
And Brandon, I just want to share with our audience that with Zoom, if you and you're on a desktop, if you can put your cursor between the two screens, and you can make Brandon larger or smaller as you wish. So you can hold your cursor down and move to the left or right. I just discovered this myself, so feel free to make him as big as or small as you need him.
That is great to know, because now I won't worry about putting the slides up and down. We had talked about earlier that my slides are more about keeping me on track, so it's not always as useful to have that on the big screen as being able to see me up close. I'm a hand talker and, you know, facial expressions. But if each of you gets to choose how big you want the slides versus how big you want my face, then I'll just leave it up. That makes it a lot easier. So language is a living thing. Any word that is used by a person to mean something, that word means that thing in that specific instance, right? Anxiety means a lot of things, but generally, when we're talking about anxiety, we're talking about concern for the future. There is some uncertainty, some worry that something might go badly, or hope that it will go well, but fear that it won't, and etc. Even in cases where we're talking about anxiety about, did I misunderstand something? Did I miss something? Did I make a mistake? All of that is still future focused. you're thinking about something that either is happening or happened in the past, but only because for whatever reason, your brain has determined that it is relevant to something that is potentially coming up. The question that always we're trying to ask is, what do I do next? Whenever we're asking questions like, why do I do what I do? What happened there? It's all because somehow that weighs into the question of, what do I do next? So this is a very common way that people will use the word anxiety. I have anxiety, talking about anxiety as a condition, as a way of being that stays more or less the same over time, unless it's modified by medical stuff, medicine or whatever treatments. And obviously there is a biological component to anxiety. Part of what what is happening when you're feeling anxiety is that there is stuff happening in your brain, in your body, chemicals being released into your bloodstream. We're not going to focus as much tonight on this. Again, partly because that's not my particular expertise. There are other people who are better suited to talk about various medicines and that kind of thing. But also, I want to just put this out there to people that looking at anxiety this way, it's still, there's the question of, is it static? Do you always feel anxious in the same way to the same extent from moment to moment, day to day, week to week? And of course, no, nobody does. We human beings, we don't stay the same, exactly the same for very long at all. So no matter what biology is impacting your experience of anxiety, it's a part of what's going on. We're still also responding to the things that are happening in the environment. There are things that make you more anxious or less anxious. There are times and places and activities that are going to bring up the anxiety for you, or in which you almost never are going to experience anxiety. It's important to note that this is a universal thing. We all get anxious from time to time. There are ways in which it is different for each of us. How often we get anxious, how frequently it happens, how intense the experience of anxiety is when it happens, how long it lasts when we get anxious, how long does it take us to get out of that state? What is the impact that it has on us? For example, if being in a school environment makes me anxious, that's going to have probably a much larger impact on me if I'm a high school student than being in a swimming pool making me anxious is going to have. So we're not looking at trying to go and become people who never, ever experience anxiety, but we are, as much as possible, trying to get it to be less often, less intense. We get out of it quicker, and whatever impact it has on us and what we're trying to do is not as much of a problem as it has been. I'm an anxious person. This is another way that people talk about anxiety, as a personality trait, as a response. And for whatever reason, if I'm saying I'm an anxious person, I'm saying that I'm more likely to respond to something in a way that we would all call anxious. I will get anxious in response to something that happens more frequently than the average person, or more frequently than you will, or more frequently than I have in the past. So again, when people are talking about it like this, they're making predictions about how they or whoever they're talking about is going to respond to something. I want to be clear that both the way before and this one are incredibly valid and useful ways to talk about anxiety. And we need to split them all up. I'm already probably not going to be able to get through everything that I want to get through tonight, but we're going to focus on this one here. I'm feeling anxious, the experience of anxiety. What is it like in my body, in my head, when I'm experiencing anxiety? We're going to focus on that because that is the place where we can do the most. And as individuals and as people who are helping other individuals, where we can get some information, make some plans, try some things, see what works and what doesn't, and just keep trying until we get to a place where we're comfortable with whatever's happening. And that may never happen, or it might happen quickly. It might happen and then it might stop happening, but we're trying to move in that direction. So when we're talking about an experience, any experience, but specifically tonight, anxiety, we're talking about something that you are aware of, something that you notice. I get questions a lot from people who will say things like, maybe I'm depressed, maybe I'm anxious. And my response always, they'll say, do you think I'm anxious? I'll say, do you feel anxious? There are all kinds of things that happen in our body without our awareness, but anxiety, like depression, like sadness, like happiness, like any emotion, it's something that we need to be able to notice to say that it's there. And of course, we went through all those definitions just as a way of making clear that we'll use the word differently in different circumstances. So if someone is talking about some kind of anxiety that can be secret from you, that your body's experiencing an increased heart rate or without you noticing, that's just a different way of talking about it. We're talking about what we notice. And in particular, we're going to break it down into two categories: physical, and I'm trying to avoid the word feelings, because feeling, I can feel something physically. We're going to use the word sensation for that: a sight, a sound, a touch, a sense, something. One of my sensory organs is picking something up and passing it along to my brain. That part is always going to happen. When you're saying that you're feeling anxious, you're almost always going to be noticing the physical element first. If you notice the thoughts first, you'll soon connect it to the physical feeling as well. Then there's the cognition, thoughts. What is it that's happening in my head? And note that it doesn't matter whether what's happening in my head, whether those thoughts are realistic, are rational, are, accurate in any way. It just matters what I'm thinking. We can do different things depending on whether we think they're rational or realistic or not, but it doesn't matter as far as what the experience is. So effectively, what we're talking about is I'll sense something. For me personally, and this is a very common physical sensation that accompanies anxiety, I get a sense right here, right in the middle of, I think of it as right below my rib cage, right behind my sternum. And to me, it feels like pressure. It feels like something is expanding. And the worse the anxiety is, the more intense that feeling. Sometimes feels like I can't quite breathe because there's not enough room in there, or like I'm about to burst. This is a pretty common one, but not universal. And know that really none of what we're going to talk about in terms of the specific things that you notice, whether it's a physical sensation or a way of thinking, none of those things are going to apply to every single person. So if it doesn't apply to you, that doesn't mean that you're not experiencing anxiety. It just means that that example didn't apply to you. So I feel that. But when I'm really excited, I feel the same feeling. That feeling for me is common to both things. So whatever we're experiencing emotionally, we're observing stuff, and then we match it up with other things. If I'm feeling this, and I'm also thinking about something that I'm worried about or nervous about, then I'm going to say, oh, this is anxiety. If I'm feeling this, but I'm thinking about, oh, how great that date just was. I don't know why, but my first date with my wife just popped in my head because I was really feeling that night. Then I'm going to think it's excitement. And it's not just one physical sensation and one thought. There can be all kinds of things. Any of you who've explored this in more depth with, people who work with anxiety, you might have gotten some version of the question, where does the anxiety live in your body? Or what part of your body is telling you that you're anxious? And those are great questions, because we do want to be able to observe in detail what's happening to us so that we can be specific about it. I'm just going to talk about some ways that I think are useful. This is one of them. Anxiety is trying to solve a problem by thinking about it. There are some problems that can't be solved by thinking, but we try anyway. And if you are somebody who is prone to anxiety, then I can say pretty confidently that you are somebody who's prone to thinking about problems generally. That when you're exposed to something, when you encounter something problematic, your first thought is a thought. Your first reaction is to step back and say, okay, let me take a second. Let me think through all the angles here. What do I know? Sometimes it happens like that. Sometimes it takes days, weeks, months. Sometimes it never finishes. So just some thoughts here to share. If if you are somebody who has been accused or accuses yourself of overthinking things in some kind of a consistent way, I have a tendency to overthink things. Know that humans adapt very quickly. If you're doing something and it's causing you a problem, you'll drop it pretty fast, unless that thing also works for you. And if that's the case, it has to work for you a lot more often than it doesn't, because we notice negative stuff, bad, painful experiences much more strongly than we notice positive things. So different people will talk about the ratios of how many times something has to go well compared to how many times it goes poorly for you to be willing to continue to do that thing. If you are overthinking things, all that's really happening is you're thinking to solve problems. Sometimes it doesn't work, and you're noticing the times that it doesn't work. We're going to talk later about how there's not really much of a way to just shift that by wanting it to shift anyway. It feels good until it feels bad, and then it feels bad until it doesn't. Meaning, when you're trying to work through something, we start thinking about whatever problem because we think there's some value in that. We think that, okay, if I dedicate some time and energy to this, I will be better prepared or able to avoid it. And when it works, great. We feel smart, we feel accomplished, we feel competent. But at a certain point, it starts to shift. And now we're starting to think, uh-oh, this isn't working. I'm trying to think about it, it's not working. Usually, if you're already thinking about a problem and it's not working, you're going to double down. You know, it's kind of like when you walk up to a door that you, as you're approaching it, it looks for whatever reason to you like it's a door that you're supposed to pull open, but in reality, it's a door that you push. When you go and you try and pull it and it doesn't move, what's the very next thing that you do? You pull it again just a little bit harder. It's a lot easier, it's a lot simpler to try the same solution again with just a little extra effort than it is to step back and come up with a new solution. So if you're trying to think about something and it's not working, the first response almost always will be, I better think about this more. I better care more. If you're talking about other people, we hear these phrases all the time, right? That, oh, they just don't care enough. They got to try harder. They don't realize how important it is. We think that we can just think more and it'll work. And sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it doesn't work because you don't have the information you need to be able to think through a problem. Sometimes problems are just not things that you can think your way through, particularly problems that you can't actually do anything about in the moment. This is a little bit of a more poetic way to talk about it that I like. Anxiety is being painfully aware of the fact that you can't predict the future. The fact that you can't predict the future doesn't change. We never can predict the future. We make guesses about what's going to happen. And if we have a lot of experience or information, our guesses turn out to be useful quite frequently. But nobody's batting 1,000, right? Like nobody is guessing correctly about how everything will go 100% of the time. And even if you are, if I say, for example, that I think tomorrow my son is going to want to go outside and jump on the trampoline, and he does, great. The part of it, the elements of tomorrow that I made a guess about ended up being accurate and useful, but I didn't guess or think about all the other things that are impacting that. I'm not thinking specifically about what time of day or what the weather will be like. So we have an ability to make some predictions about the future, guesses that can be useful, but we can't actually know. We just mostly don't really think about that because life would be very difficult if all we did was walk around thinking about the things that we can't do. But sometimes, for some reasons, and many people here are more painfully aware of this more frequently than others, that the fact that you can't predict the future just is staring you right in the face and it hurts. I got to speed up a little bit. Anxiety, neurofibromatosis. So again, we're not going to talk about the specific biological impacts of neurofibromatosis. What we're talking about is the experience. So a bit of a metaphor here. If we all take a second and just imagine that we're sitting on a plane at the window seat looking out at this view, and you're on your way to Paris. Your whole life, your whole family, they all studied abroad in Paris. They all speak French. They spoke it around the house. You picked it up. All your friends, many of your friends at least, and many of their family, even people you don't know, but you're aware of, you just constantly are hearing about how people go to Paris and they love it and it's wonderful. And so you've intended your entire life to go there as well. And now here you are, college age, it's time to study abroad, and you're on the plane, and in the middle of the flight, the pilot comes across the loudspeaker and says, "Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to land in Paris. We've been rerouted. We're going to Tokyo." Yeah, this is a bit of a ridiculous metaphor. I don't know why you'd get rerouted to Tokyo. And now, for whatever reason, you have to study abroad in Tokyo. That is going to be an incredibly anxious experience, not because Tokyo is worse than Paris or better than Paris. Some people's experience in Tokyo will be worse, some will be better, some will be more excited about it than others. But there's nothing inherent about it that means that now this is definitely going to be terrible. It's just that you were prepared for the other thing. You learned the language. You knew you had a list of restaurants from your mom to go check out. And now you have to rethink it all. Stuff that you had long ago resolved and said, it's not worth me even bothering to think anymore about this stuff, all of a sudden becomes an issue again. Where am I going to stay? What am I going to do? Where am I going to eat? The people I communicated with, right? It's different. And the fact that it is different than what you thought is inherently anxiety inducing. In the case of getting a diagnosis of neurofibromatosis, there is actual also reason to be upset about the difference. Not that it necessarily means that everything is going to be worse than it would otherwise been. How would we know? But there's reason to believe that it is a experience you would have preferred to avoid. But we're on the plane. There's no getting off, right? So we have to adapt. I need to get my, I don't remember what slides are coming out. I just closed my presenter view. What we want to talk about, the way of looking at anxiety that I'm going to offer today is dividing it up into a couple of different pieces and looking at the relationship between those pieces. So remember, we talked about anxiety is future focused. It's about trying to make predictions about what's going to happen and then come up with ideas of what you could do to make it so that if the bad thing you're worried about happens, what'll you do? What can you do to make it more likely that the good thing happens, etc. Finding out that you're different. And of course, everybody is different in some ways, but there are people who are more different in more intense ways. Finding out that you're different is always going to increase your anxiety, partly because the information that you have access to now seems less relevant. In our little metaphor a bit ago, some of that stuff is obvious. You know that you're not going to be able to go to the restaurants that they recommended, but some of it you just have to question, even if it might still be applicable. If your dad said to you, hey, don't overbook yourself on the sightseeing, leave yourself plenty of open time to just meet people. You might have to question all of a sudden how much of that advice was based on his experience in Paris and might not apply in Tokyo. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. How am I supposed to find out? The brain is constantly running scenarios, trying to anticipate what might happen so that we can make things go as well as they possibly can. But we rely on all kinds of information for that. The reason we were talking a second ago about why some people with expertise and experience and knowledge can make more useful predictions more frequently is because they have more information about it. Well, all of a sudden, your ideas about what life is, your reference points of everybody else who doesn't have NF or whose child doesn't have NF, you have to question how useful all that stuff is. It's a whole different set of conversations. And thank goodness that you guys have found this organization, other people that you can share with, because that's a way to kind of start restocking up on that information, new things, so that you can say, well, sure, people say that this happens, but what about what happens to people with NF? Now you have a group of people that you can reference and talk to about that. So that's part of the reason the anxiety is going to go up no matter what. Another part is because you got a diagnosis. Presumably you were experiencing something, some symptoms that were problematic in some way, and all of you are going to have different stories about what exactly brought you to the path of looking into it, right? But at first, whatever those things are that were happening, your immediate connection most likely was not, I think this might be neurofibromatosis. At first, it was a million other theories. Maybe it's this, maybe I'm sore here because I tweaked a muscle, maybe whatever it might be. When you get the diagnosis, it can be a relief to say, oh, okay, all this stuff makes more sense. I know what I'm dealing with now. It can also be terrifying because now you're looking at what's going to happen next, the prognosis. Oh, what does this mean for my future? But no matter what, you now have at least one experience. And there are other ways to get this, but this is a definitive one that all of you have had. You've had at least one experience where you were struggling with something, couldn't figure it out, and then somebody else did. They told you what was happening. They can look and say definitively, this is what's happening. What that means is the next time you're struggling with something, your brain has more reason to believe that other people might be able to solve it, identify it, categorize what's going on that you're just missing. In other words, not only do you have less information to be able to make predictions about the future, you're less confident in any of those predictions that you make because you've made lots of predictions in the past that turned out to be wrong. Not just because somebody diagnosed you, that's part of it, but also because you didn't predict that you were going to get this diagnosis. So, predictions, future-oriented, thinking, trying to solve problems. I'm saying a lot of these words over and over. Here's how we're going to break it down. Remember, this is an additional way of looking at things, not trying to replace or say definitively this is what all anxiety is. We're focusing on the gap between two things. One is this thing I'm thinking about. How important is it to me that it go the way I want it to go? Or how important is it to me that it don't go the way that I'm worried that it will go? The other is, how likely do I think it is that it will go the way I want it to, or that it won't go the way I'm trying to avoid? The gap between those two things is anxiety. The larger that gap, the more important and the less confident we are, the worse the anxiety becomes. So what we're trying to do when we get to looking at interventions and things that will help is we're trying to shorten that gap. We can do that by moving one side, moving the other, or moving both. So when we're talking about how important, we're saying, again, still our predictions. And yes, there is an infinite number of things that can happen, but we are not infinite people, our brains. We can only think about so many things. So mostly we're thinking about the things that we want the most, we fear the most, or we think are the most likely. Those three things tend to be where we're looking. So we ask, what am I hoping is going to happen here? What am I worried might happen here? And what's the difference, not between necessarily those two things, but if I'm hoping to ace the test tomorrow, all the other outcomes are bad for me, right? That's the one that I want. Anything else is bad. Different degrees of it, but that's where we're going to ask the difference. What's the difference between me getting an A and me getting a B? What's the difference between me getting an A and me getting an F? Do I think it's likely that if I don't get an A, I might get an F, or am I just worried about an A or a B? On the other side, what am I worried might happen? We're talking about fear. And of course, just like anxiety, fear is a word that means a lot of different things. But in this case, we're talking about fear as a specific type of anxiety, where instead of worrying about how do I get the good thing that I'm hoping for, I'm worried about how do I avoid this terrible thing that I don't want to happen. And particularly for this group of people, but it does apply to everybody, the worst thing at the end of that for your brain, my brain, human brains generally, is the possibility of death. Mostly, I mean, there are ways to talk about any fear that you have as being related to that fear in some way. If it's a fear about wasting time, well, I want to conserve resources in case something else comes along later. If it's a fear about embarrassing yourself or alienating people, being isolated and abandoned by other people is not advantageous. It's not a good situation when you're trying to stay alive. So this particular fear And for this particular group of people, everybody is worried about it, but the frequency, the intensity, the duration, how long it lasts, the impact, not everybody has the same reason to worry about it the same amount. We're going to talk in a little bit about going offline, but this is relevant here. We don't want to have to think about that. Anything that makes you think about it is something you don't like. I saw many of you submitted questions or thoughts about the kinds of things that you're trying to explore, or the things that cause you the most anxiety. And that was a big one that came up over and over. And I want to treat it with the gravity that it deserves, that everybody is wondering what's going to happen. Is this okay? Is this cancerous? Am I going to die? Terrifying. And there's not a way around the fact that it's terrifying. There's no way to become comfortable with the idea of it happening. We just want to think about it as little as possible. We'll get to some stuff when we talk about this, the interventions, in a minute. So that's how important is it? And the maximum importance is staying alive. How confident am I that it will go the way I'm hoping it will go? So first, we just can make a guess. How likely is it? Your brain is doing this. You may not always automatically put it in terms of a percentage, right? That it's, oh, I think 60% chance that I blah, blah, blah. But you can, if you pay attention, you can slap a random percentage on it, or odds, or whatever. So you're guessing. Your brain is running scenarios at all times saying, what do I think is going to happen? What is worth doing? There's a particular theory that is very helpful with all this stuff, but we won't get too much into it, called cognitive miser theory, which is just that the brain doesn't spend resources unless it has a reason to do so. And our brains are wrong all the time. We spend resources on things that end up not being worth what we did. And we ignore things that end up, well, it would have been great if we'd paid attention. But our brain is constantly doing that. In any given moment, there is so much more that your eyes and ears and skin and all these senses are picking up than you can be aware of. And you don't get to consciously decide what things you notice and what you don't. We can impact it. We can do some things to try and make it go where we want it to go, but you can't consciously choose. If you were going to try that, you'd have to be aware of everything first to then determine what's worth being aware of. This is an important one. I will often say I use this same, I kind of think of it as a party trick every time I talk about this, that until I say what I'm about to say 5 seconds from now, each of you is not consciously aware in this moment. You're not noticing the feeling of the chair underneath your body, or the bed, or the floor. And as soon as I said that, you became aware of that feeling. Our brain is making determinations constantly without us knowing about what is worth thinking about. And in anxiety in particular, that is a huge part of what's going on. Our brain is making decisions about what's worth thinking about that end up not being correct as far as we can tell. So how likely is it to go the way that I want it to go? How certain am I? If I say, yeah, I think, I'm pretty sure it'll most likely go well, but I don't know. I've never done it before. So that's a iffy guess versus, no, I've done this hundreds of times, 9 times out of 10, it goes well. So I'm really confident about that. And how much influence do I have? What can I do, if anything, to influence the outcome here? If I'm playing the lottery, I think it's pretty unlikely that I win. I'm pretty certain about my guess that it's very unlikely. And I don't really think there's much I can do about it. If I am getting ready for a test, well, maybe if I study or prepare in a certain way, that might influence it. Or if there's something I'm worried, I'm going to go to a party, and what if somebody thinks that I'm weird, right? Then I might or might not be able to control the way that they're perceiving me, but I do have some influence in how I respond to that. That if I get a sense that that's happening, what do I do at that point? I can handle it in different ways, and some of those ways I might like better than others. So the larger the gap between those two things, my mouth is getting really dry. The larger the gap between those two things, the more intense the experience of the anxiety is. we're going to break our interventions, the things that we can try to do to make the experience of anxiety less frequent, less intense, last less long, lower duration, and have a less of a detrimental impact. We're going to split that into talking about coping and prevention, and how we're distinguishing, how we're separating between coping and prevention is there is, as the anxiety grows, there is an experience, we can track it. The fun, fancy word for it is prefrontal cortex shutdown, but we don't need to talk about all the ridiculous over intellectual jargon that we like to use in the sciences. We have this experience, each of us, all the time, constantly throughout the day. What's happening is our brain likes to spend resources on thinking. It's better, generally speaking, to approach something with some forethought, with some advance warning, to be able to prepare, think through your different options and what might you want to do. But it's not always possible. So we'll do whatever we need to do to get by, to navigate our environment. Only if the environment itself, the place that we are at, the actual time and space that we're in, only if that environment isn't bringing a lot of problems to us, are we able to spare resources, energy to think about things. So vice versa, that means if we're thinking about stuff and then all of a sudden something is happening in the environment, it starts to shut down our ability to think. Specifically, the prefrontal cortex electrical activity decreases rapidly and picks up in the limbic system, but that's stuff you don't need to know. We mostly, colloquially, commonly we call this fight or flight. We all know the experience. There are times when you are thinking a lot. There are times where you're thinking not at all. And those times when you're not able to think, they're not always bad. Sometimes, sure, it's, a loud noise all of a sudden unexpectedly, and now I can't, whatever I was thinking about before is disrupted because I got to deal with this thing. But sometimes it's things like you're engaged in a sport that you love, and in order to do what you're trying to do there, it takes all of your resources to focus in on that moment, to navigating the environment and moving your body in a certain kind of way. And so there's nothing left over to think with. And similarly, sometimes thinking is great. We're daydreaming, we're fantasizing, we're planning and strategizing, and sometimes it is terrible. We're anxious. We're going to call that going offline, that when you're thinking, you're online. When you're not thinking anymore and you're just navigating the environment, you're offline. Importantly, this is not on and off like a light switch. And none of this stuff is. We can't say I'm feeling anxious, I'm not feeling anxious. Of course, we say that as a way to kind of talk about things quickly, but it's a slider, anxiety at the bottom and whatever you like to use for the word of the opposite of anxiety, being calm, being centered, whatever, at the top. And it goes up and down constantly. And we're trying to watch where it is as it's happening and adjust it. Fight or flight, by the way, I think an important way or an important thing to distinguish about that, we say that phrase, fight or flight, but mostly we don't actually respond to things by physically attacking them or physically running away from them. It's just a shorthand way of saying the body is making a determination that we've either got to attack this problem and deal with it right now until it's dealt with, or we got to get away from the problem. These days in our modern society, the kinds of problems that we're dealing with, mostly what we're talking about with fight behaviors is things like perfectionism or panic or stress or urgency that, I got to get going right now on this thing. Perfectionism in particular is, I don't quite know how to solve this problem. I don't quite know how to say that it's done, it's complete, but I got to just keep trying. Whereas flight is avoidance behaviors, procrastinating, distracting oneself. We extend that out and it's depressive, right? That people can be in a position in which they're saying, I can't think about anything, not even the things that I like. I can't even deal with those anymore. I just have to retreat from everything. So we're all going up and down on this constantly, all the time. When you get in the car to drive, some of your resources are now having to go towards that because it requires your attention. This is a funny slide, I'm sure, to pop up without context. Whatever you do right now, don't think about a giant purple elephant. Anything else is fine, just don't think about a giant purple elephant. And of course, as soon as that popped up, as soon as I say that, you're thinking about it. Some of you might be visualizing it. Some of you might just be saying the words. Some of you might be saying to yourself in your head, don't think about a giant purple elephant. But that is a thought about a giant purple elephant. It's just a thought about how you don't want to think about one. Humans don't have a mechanism that lets us just choose to think less about something. That's not how it works. We want to notice everything. And of course, like we said, we can't. So the brain makes its determinations about what's most worth paying attention to. We have a priority list that's constantly shifting. I kind of think of it like those stock tickers where things are moving up and down constantly all the time. But there's a priority list, and we just notice as much as we can until we get far enough down the list that there's no room for anything else. So if you're feeling anxious about something, if you're thinking about something constantly, or if you're thinking about it more than it seems helpful, or in a way that's causing you problems, causing you distress, anxiety, you can't just will it away. In fact, the more you try, the worse it will be. There's another fancy jargon term, ego dystonic intrusive thoughts, which just means the brain, your brain, my brain, it thinks random thoughts all the time. Its job is to keep us alive. So it's constantly thinking about what could cause problems for that. And some of that stuff is more or less random, right? A very common example is when people are driving down the highway and all of a sudden they have a thought about swerving off the side of the road. It just happens. But the thoughts that bother you the most, sometimes when they pop up, if you then think, what does that mean? What does it mean about me that I'm thinking that? It's not just my brain thinking through scenarios. It must be revealing of some, now I can't stop thinking about it because I'm trying to figure it out. And I may hate it. In fact, the more that you hate the thought, an intrusive thought like this, the more that you hate it, the worse it will be, the more frequently it will come up, the worse it will feel when it's there, because you hate it, because you're worried it means something about you that you hate. Stuff that you're like, oh, I wonder if that means that I might enjoy volleyball. I'm probably not going to think that very often. But a thought about swerving off the side of the road, if I'm all of a sudden going to think, does that mean I'm suicidal? And that might concern me. Now I'm thinking about it a lot. When it comes to anxiety, this is a thought-focused thing, right? We have to think about something different. Whatever it is that you're anxious about, we want to think about it less. And there's different ways to go about doing that. We're going to explore a lot of them. And I might talk even faster than I'm talking now to get through as much as we can. We can make it less important, blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, it has to be, even if we're taking the anxious thought and making it less of a priority and moving it down the list, well, that just means that whatever was behind it is now above it. So we got to find other things that are more worth it to our mind to pay attention to. I'm going to go a little bit faster here, but here are the 5 things, PIPES. I just made up this acronym earlier this afternoon. We're looking at, when we're talking about things that we want our brain to think about that might take priority over something as problematic, because that's why the importance matters. The more important something is, that means the brain is going to pour effort into thinking about it, even if it's not helping us. If something is physical, it involves your body or the environment. Immediate, it can be done right now. Positive, meaning that it's something that matters. The difference between me doing it or getting it done or experiencing it and not, it's a big difference. But the failure, the bad side of it is not a big deal. It's just that this is so good. So it's still important because it's a big gap, but it's not terrifying. It's very interesting, enjoyable, and simple. Simple meaning that it might be very difficult and take a lot of my resources, but I don't have to think through it very much. It's not something that requires a lot of complex understanding. The ocean, the ocean is incredibly vast and powerful. That much water moving constantly. If you step back and observe what it is doing, watch the tides, watch the currents, and then make a plan about how you're going to accomplish whatever thing you're wanting to accomplish, you can tap into that power. We can build things that generate electricity, and we can sail across the ocean with Thor Heyerdahl showed that we can sail across the ocean with just a raft and a sail if you know what you're doing. But on the flip side, if you don't pay attention and watch what it's doing before you just try and interact with it in some way, you might get lucky and tap into something that's helping you, or you might end up fighting against all that power, and whatever you're trying to do is that much more difficult. Your brain, your body, mine, all of ours, it's like the ocean in that way. There are things that it does, and we don't need to know why. We can come up with theories and stories about why it's doing what it's doing, why we're thinking what we're thinking, but we can also just observe. You don't need to know why the currents go the way that they go. You can just watch what they do. If you observe yourself first, then you can tap into all that power. If you try to force yourself to do something different than everything you've ever observed yourself do, you're likely going to be fighting against all that power. So in terms of coping, I think I might be skipping some of my slides accidentally, actually. Tech is not my strong suit. In terms of coping, we want you to observe what it is that you already do that you enjoy. What are the things that get your attention? And start to categorize that. In this case, I've put down 6 categories, but there are other ways that we could break this up. These 5 are the 5 senses, things that I see, things that I hear, smell, taste, and feel. And I've broken that up into touch, pressure and texture, but also movement. If I'm moving my body, if I'm navigating the environment, balance, there are fun words for all these things, vibration, different senses of movement. And then social data. If you have a tendency to pay attention to people, if you have a hard time tuning things out in all of these categories, then you're going to want to pay attention to that when you're designing or coming up with whatever things you want to do. And then you're going to put together a menu, because the whole point when you're getting anxious is that your brain is going offline. It's moving in the direction where you're going to think less. So noticing what's happening is already difficult, but then coming up with something to do about it and getting yourself to do it is very hard. So when you're online, when you're in a place where you're not feeling anxious, you want to come up with your ideas. Start with, like the ocean, start with the things you already know you enjoy, that you already know pull your attention, hobbies and interests, talking to other people. If you have any meditative or mindfulness practices that you like, and there are many good lists out there about all this kind of stuff, but I'm really trying to blaze through now. Put that on a menu. I call it a menu because when you're feeling anxious, you don't want to have step 1, do this, step 2, do this. You might not always be able to do step 1. You might not be in the mood for step 1. We just want an option. Here are a list of dishes that you might want to try. Here are a list of different activities that might help me when I'm feeling that way. So I can look at the list and just say, does this sound good? No, does this sound good? And I can hit myself in different, I can hit on a solution that will work for me in different scenarios. To move into prevention, we take the same thing and we just start to map it out. I mentioned before, if there's a dimmer switch and the bottom is anxiety, the dimmer's all the way down, you're in maximum anxiety. What is the top? Pick a word, each of you, and name that. Calm, centered, whatever. Whatever it is, it's just the thing that as you become less anxious, you become more this. As you become more anxious, you become less this. I'm going to use calm. And then we scale it 0 to 10. And I start to look. First, I just think, what are things that I notice myself doing that tell me I'm feeling anxious? Maybe I pace, maybe I bite my lip, maybe I start to talk fast like I'm talking right now because I'm running out of time. And I'm going to write those things down, and I'm going to say, when I'm starting to pace, I think that means that I'm just starting to lose my calm. So I'm at an 8. But when I start to bite my nails, that's getting pretty bad. So that's a 4. And we map it again. I'm pointing to the thing. I don't know why you can't see my other screen. And we do the same thing by going to people, starting with someone that you trust the most. And you don't have to go to anyone. And you can go to as many people as you feel comfortable with and ask them, what did they notice that tells them that you might be feeling anxious? A lot of what they say might be stuff you're already aware of, but you never know what you don't know. Maybe they notice things that you don't, and it's good to map that there too. And then I can take my menu and start to put those exercises, activities, experiences, whatever it is, I can map those against that same thing. There are some things that I might do when I'm only just starting to lose my calm a little bit, but are not going to be helpful for me when I'm about to be in a full-blown panic attack. And there are other things that are worth doing when I'm about to be in a full-blown panic attack that are not worth doing when I'm just starting to lose my calm. So what we're trying to do here is be better able to notice as we're approaching that offline, taking it from the on off to more of a switch. I'm at a 9, I'm at a 4, I'm at a 3. We can start to watch for those things as they're happening so that we can intervene earlier. We can do something before it becomes a big problem. If we back up even more, and I think this is my last, second to last. There's another way we can look at, I call odds and stakes. And this is just another way of looking at how likely is it versus how important is it. I'm looking at the odds and I want to give a percentage number for myself. What do I think the chances are of getting what I want out of this? 60%. And then I can start to ask myself, okay, am I comfortable with that? If not, what is there? Is there anything I can do that would make that number go higher? Remember, it doesn't matter whether it's accurate. It's about what I'm feeling like. So if studying for the test doesn't actually make me better able to pass it, but it makes me feel more prepared for it, then it makes the number go up. So I can target things like that, saying, what can I do to make the number go up? But also I can use it to just observe what I'm doing or thinking about doing as an additional question for myself. This thing that I'm considering doing, do I think that would make the number go up or the number go down of how likely it is that I'm going to get what I want, or how likely it is at least that I'm going to avoid the outcome that I'm trying to avoid. On the flip side are the stakes, meaning how much are you risking in order to potentially get what, right? So just as a way to explain all this, if we're playing a game and you say, hey, Brandon, we're going to play a game, flip a coin, 50-50 chance. If I win $1. If I lose $1. I might play that game a bit. If I think that playing the game is fun, I don't expect to get more out of it than I put into it, but the experience might be fun. So maybe I'll do it. But if you tell me that I get a 51% chance, I'm going to win $1, 49% chance, I'm going to lose $1, I'm going to play that game until you make me stop, because I'm going to win more than I'm going to lose. And even if I lose 40 times in a row, I can stand 40 losses of $1 in a row before I start winning again. But if we change the stakes, you're still 51% chance I win, 49% chance I lose. But if I win $1. If I lose $2. Now all of a sudden, I don't want to play this game anymore. And it's important to know that there are some stakes that are just not worth it, no matter what the odds are. That if I think it's a 99.8% chance that I'm going to win, and if I win, I have a wonderful vacation, but on that very off chance, I lose my closest friend, I'm probably not going to go on the vacation. A lot of what we do in response to anxiety is making decisions about avoiding an environment in which the problem might happen. We're deciding whether it's worth trying or not. A lot of the time, we don't get a choice. We have to deal with it. And that removes that option for us to avoid it. But we still want to look at, okay, if I get what I want, what am I getting? If I experience the thing I'm trying not to experience, what am I losing? Can I raise the floor means, is there any way I can make it so that if I lose, it won't be as bad, that I'll be more prepared for it, or that I can make it so that it doesn't impact me as negatively? And then that question at the end, am I sure I want to play? I'm going through this stuff really quickly because this is the last thing and the most important thing. And then I have time to stick around and do some questions if anybody would like to. I know we're wrapping up right now at 8 o'clock. These 3 questions, to me, there are 3 skills that you can master. There are 3 skills that if you master them, you can do literally anything that any human being is capable of doing, because you could get the human who's capable of doing it to help you do it. The first is awareness of yourself and of whatever it is you're trying to do, so that you can assess accurately. You can tell, what do I need? What can I do on my own? And what could I do if I had help? The second is identifying a source to get that support. an appropriate source, one that you can go to and actually get it from. And then the third is going and getting the help. So these questions, I very specifically say, what help could I use? Not do I need help or what help do I need? Because need is a high bar to pass when you're talking about getting help. Help is helpful, whether you need it or not. That's the point of it. That's why we call it help. So what help could I use? Where could I get that help? And then what will it cost me to get that help? Whether it's just the act of asking for it or making it clear to somebody that you're struggling, or it could cost money and time and all kinds of different things. So help is always helpful. It's just not always worth what it will cost you. But looking at these three things, because at the end of the day, if your brain is offline, none of these strategies that we're talking about are going to work very well for you because your brain is offline. You're not going to think to do them. At the end of the day, you want people around you. That's part of why we have the what do others notice, because you can get other people involved in that prevention menu, that scaling exercise. You want people around you to be able to help out when they notice there's a problem. We want to help ourselves as much as possible because you're the only thing that you know you will always have access to. But that's not always enough. And especially in things that are making us anxious, a lot of the time we're anxious because we have a sense, accurate or not, we have a sense that we're not going to be able to handle it by ourselves, or at least we're doubting whether we can handle it on our own. So being able to identify good people to help you, surrounding yourself with those people, communicating with them about the kinds of things you experience and the kinds of things that are helpful for you, and them doing the same for you. That's what it means to be in a relationship, to be in a community, is we give to each other, we help each other when the time is right for that. I'm sorry, I had to rush through a lot of that end stuff. I didn't manage my time as well as I would have liked, but I do have time for questions and answers if anybody would like to ask some.
All right, Brandon. So hi, guys. I'm Zoe. I'm Rosemary Anderson's daughter. I am going to try to bring up as many things as I can with Brandon. So many great, very specific questions, Brandon, people with specific experiences that I think would be great to just get feedback on based on what you've shared with us today. I'm going to start with Susan. So Susan says, my son has an intense fear of needles. It's so bad he wants them to knock him out before getting an IV or a shot, etc. Most of the time they've been able to give him something to relax him or gas, then put the IV in because it's for a procedure with anesthesia. Recently, he needs a lot of additional care that requires IVs without anesthesia related, without an anesthesia related procedure. And he goes into complete lockdown to where we can't progress with the treatment or procedure. He will hyper focus on it to the point he can't even sleep. Where we live, there's limited counselors for kids with special medical needs, and the local OCD anxiety specialty center has a very long wait list. What do you recommend we do between now and then when we can get in with the specialist? Yoga, praying, meditating, nothing works. Sorry for the length of the message.
I like long messages. That gives me a lot of information to work with. Yeah, so I can't say specifically what will work, but your son is focused on one way of dealing with the anxiety, which is the, am I sure I want to play, right? He doesn't want to do it. Whatever the fear of the needle is, there's something in there that he is concerned about. And maybe it's just the experience of the pain of it being put in. Maybe it's that he's worried about what will happen after it's there. Who knows? And of course, we didn't talk about today trauma and how experiences of things impact all this and why things can be more triggering. But within the framework of what we did talk about today, we're not going to distinguish from that, or we're not going to distinguish those kinds of things separately and talk about what counts as trauma and what doesn't. It's just experiences make you, if you do something and it goes badly, if you experience pain, the whole point of what pain is a signal to your brain saying, I don't like this, I don't want this anymore. So every time you do something and it goes badly, you're going to want to avoid it even more the next time. Part of what's happening here, at least one way of talking about it, is that not only the experience of getting the needle, the IV put in has gone badly in some kind of a way, but now the anticipation of the needle, the fear itself, is a bad experience. The days leading up to it is miserable, both for him and for you. So as much as possible, we've got to try and disrupt that process. And yes, the meditation, the yoga, all that stuff that stuff can work for people. Obviously, it hasn't worked for you. And we're going to keep just coming up with new things to try, but a couple different things that might help. Number one, whatever you try to explore with them, as much as you can, as best as you are able, make it so that whatever you're suggesting is not about his anxiety or the needle. It's the purple elephant again, right? No matter what I'm doing, if you're afraid of getting a needle, if you're afraid of getting an IV put in, and I'm like, hey, listen, don't worry about it. We're going to focus on this other thing. Look how beautiful this is. Look how fun this is. See, isn't this better than thinking of the needle? Then I'm right back at the needle. In other words, if we're doing something for the explicit purpose, we're saying we're doing this only to address the fear, the anxiety, the pain, the discomfort, then it's making it about that thing. So even if meditation might theoretically have worked for somebody, if we're saying we're trying to meditate in order to get rid of the fear, it probably won't work, because as they're meditating, they're just going to be afraid. What that means is we got to tap into things that we authentically enjoy. So for him, as much as possible, getting into stuff that he likes, and you have to find a way to get into it authentically. You have to find a way to actually enjoy it, because just telling him to do it or offering for him to do it likely won't work. But it might work if you're doing it with him. If he can focus, I'm going to just say video games here because that's a very common one, especially for younger boys. If there's a certain video game that he loves playing, well, he's done that a lot. It's not novel. But if you start playing it with him, now in addition to looking at the game, I'm also, it's like when you really love a movie and you have somebody watch it with you, and everyone will complain about like you're watching their reactions. He's got that much more to pay attention to. Remember, we're trying to fill up his awareness so much that he forgets about the needle. And the needle is so bad to him at this point that it is hard to get other things to be a higher priority. But we're going to start there. And if there's not something like that that you can identify that he already enjoys, that you might be able to engage with him on or do a new version of or something like that, if that doesn't work, then you can also start looking at things that either you enjoy or that you think he might enjoy and bringing those up and offering those things. Because again, authentically then, sure, we're talking about it because of the needle, but we don't have to reference that. I want you to come play tennis with me because I love playing tennis and I love spending time with you. So let's go do that together. Or I love this book, let's read it together, or whatever kind of a thing. I know that that is probably, what's the word I'm looking for? Thin gruel? No, I don't know. That sounds oversimplified, but there are limits to what we can do. In the experience of, I was focusing there on like the fear leading up to it, because you were talking about in the question, like trouble sleeping and all that kind of stuff beforehand. But in time, when it comes time for the actual needle to be put in, yeah, he's trying to get knocked out, which when that can happen, great. And when it can't, we want to then, instead of just saying you're no longer capable of noticing anything, we really want to up the importance, the priority of whatever other thing we're trying to get you to pay attention to. Think of it like misdirection in a magic show, right? That like, if I do so much fancy stuff over here that you've never seen before, and it's so appealing to look at and pay attention to, you won't notice this thing over here. It's just that in this case, the thing over here is a really high priority thing for him. So overdo it. I mean, honestly, I'm just going to say some random stuff that I'm sure couldn't actually happen, or I don't know if it could actually happen or not, but I'm just trying to make the point. Bring 10 people with you and have each of those 10 people massaging a different part of him. So he's got 20 different points of input physically at the same time that the needle's going in. Or, I don't know, play 5 different songs, all of which he likes, and try to separate them out from each other. Play trivia games, play whatever you can do to give his senses and his perception something to pay attention to other than that. You can try to talk through it to decrease the importance of the needle. But again, more often than not, you're feeding into that. I often like to think of this as when you're a kid and you're worried there's a monster in the closet and you call for help, hopefully you call for help, and your parent comes in, they can sit on the edge of your bed and say, hey, listen, monsters aren't real. It can't be there. Don't worry about it. And that might help, especially while you're talking about it, because I'm focused on you. But as soon as you leave, well, nothing has changed. I already knew monsters weren't real. what we want to do is when they call you in, you come in and you open the door and show them that there's nothing there. So every time you have the experience and it doesn't have the bad thing that you're worried about, which requires that we make it safe for people to have that experience. I'm talking real fast. I know, Zoe, interrupt me if you need to, but because the fear itself, the anxiety itself is the problem now. I'm guessing that when he gets the IV, that it's not actually usually causing much more of a problem than it might for, a little bit of pain or discomfort or whatever. That could be inaccurate. And if that's the case, you're going to want to have deal with this differently. But it's more the anticipation and the fear that's the problem. We want him to be able to have that experience without the fear and the anxiety. So if you can get this once, and even if you have, it's not about having no fear or anxiety, but less fear or less anxiety than what he was anticipating, that we're just showing, hey, it's not as bad as you were worried it might be, then the next time it's less fearful. And if we can, again, at that point say, hey, it's still not as bad as you were worried it might be, over time we go that way. Because so far it's been cycling up. I'm worried it'll be bad, and it turns out even worse than I thought it was going to be. So now I'm really worried, but it's even worse than that. We want to start cycling it down.
So Brandon, we're going to be wrapping up in about 18 minutes, so at 8:30 Central Time. I did want to share something that my mom just posted. And Mom, if you have additional advice, if you switch it to everyone, then everyone actually gets the response. She said there is a device that the local adolescent clinic uses that makes the needle far less traumatic. She'll try to get some more info for you, Susan. I want to bring up a couple other, let's see if we can take maybe 5 minutes for a couple additional examples, and then some more general questions we have. So we've got, I have NF, and he's 72 years old. He's dissolving a business and starting a new business, so feeling very anxious about the entire process. This is affecting his sleep patterns. What can he do to alleviate his anxiety?
So I'll restate the kind of stuff we've been talking about, right? You need to give yourself something else to focus on and take a look, all that stuff we talked about. But specifically with sleep, that's a very tricky one, because hypothetically, for the most part, we all create a very comfortable environment for us to sleep in. But the brain doesn't stop thinking about problems. If you've heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right, that there's like, I need food and water and shelter, and then I need some safety and security, and then social and blah, blah, blah. You take care of the bigger problems, well, you just have smaller problems to worry about. There's always something next on the list. And when you're going to sleep, which is an incredibly complicated process, I've barely scratched the surface of understanding the biology behind it. And even the little bit I know, it's a lot of different processes happening in the right order, if anything gets off, it gets all kinds of messed up. So this one, I'm going to talk about two different things. Number one, really go back and look at those categories. Some people, for example, will swear that a scent diffuser, if they put, and maybe somebody would know, I don't know enough about it. I barely have a sense of smell. That if you have the right scent in the air, that will relax you. Some people have white noise machines or face masks or projected lights up onto the ceiling. What you're looking for is, in this sense, something that is novel. So it doesn't just repeat a pattern over and over, like lava lamps, for example, for a visual thing, but it all happens within a constraint. Effectively, what we're looking for is something that you are not worried about, that no matter what won't harm you, but other than knowing that, you can't predict exactly what's going to happen, so it incentivizes you to pay attention. The other thing with sleep is to look at what happens naturally. Sleep, especially, people will try to force their bodies and brains to go to sleep at a different time or in a different environment than what is preferred. Meaning, some of us, for whatever reason, our bodies and brains shut down at about 2 a.m. and wake up at about 9:30 a.m. But we think of going to bed at 10, I'm talking about myself here, and waking up at 6 as important. In my case, I have 3 young kids. I don't really have the option to sleep in until 9. You can do that, But in order to do that, you have to do a lot of stuff to pull you off of your natural pattern. Think of it like a rubber band. It's not that you shift to 10 and now it's easy. It's that tension stays. And so whatever you're doing to keep yourself here, you got to keep doing it. If you're especially, and I know I'm focusing in on sleep when really there was a lot of other stuff going on there too. But just since that was mentioned in the question, if you're struggling with sleep, look at giving your brain something to do. Reading a book in bed until you fall asleep can help. Or look at shifting your sleeping pattern, your sleeping habits. Maybe you want to take more naps or whatever works naturally for you. As far as the anxiety about what's going to happen with your business, obviously I don't know enough about the specifics of any of that to make any specific suggestions, but you would want to find people who can provide you some help in terms of either adding specific thoughts because they know your business or they know the things you're worried about and could potentially give you information, or put things together in some kind of a way that you haven't yet. And so they're giving you something new, or that they can help explore for you how big the gap is between, oh, if it goes well, or, oh, if it goes this terrible way that I'm worried it will go. Is there anything that we can do to make it so that the bad state, the thing I'm worried about isn't quite as bad? And sometimes anxiety is something that you can just talk about and think about and get some resolution there. We can reframe what we're looking at, see it in a different way and say, oh yeah, I guess it isn't that bad. That does happen. I try not to focus on that because by the time somebody's asking me questions, usually it's past the point where we can just kind of rethink it. You want to get out of your head and into your body as much as possible. Anything that draws you into the moment, access those senses, move around, that kind of stuff.
Brandon, I feel like that's a good segue to the numerous people whose anxiety comes from their pain, right? So the fear of pain, the constant debilitating pain that they're experiencing. I have one person saying, what can I do when I get anxiety at work? I'm scared that my pain will be so bad I'll need to miss work. And along with that, someone was asking what if the coping mechanism is, and I assume that this often becomes the case when pain is involved. What if the coping mechanism is to turn to alcohol or drugs? Not terribly healthy, but very hard to fight if that is the default.
All right, so two different things, and I'm going to start with the health thing first, and then help me remember, Zoe, to get back to the concern about what if it gets so bad at work, right?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Health in particular is a really tricky one for anxiety, and obviously, especially with people who are diagnosed with NF. Because it is a very valid and useful thing to talk about healthy things versus unhealthy things. What we tend to forget about is that is all predictive. Saying that it's healthy to eat vegetables and unhealthy to eat junk food means what we're saying is, in the studies, in the cases that we've looked at, averaging things together, more often when people did this, they had outcomes that we would like, and when they did this, they have outcomes that we wouldn't like. So it's all about making predictions. There is a balancing act to find between utilizing those things, using them for what they're helpful for, and not making them too sacred and important as though there is no other possibility. Actually, sleep is a great example of this. It's healthiest to sleep 8 hours a night or 7 hours a night, depending on what study you're looking at. That doesn't mean that in the studies, any individual person slept exactly 8 hours. It certainly doesn't mean that you as a person need exactly 8 hours of sleep every single night, no matter what. Life is way too chaotic and messy for that. And honestly, when we're talking about alcohol and drug use, and let me be very clear that I am not recommending that you turn to those things by any means, but there is a concept called opportunity cost, which means if you weren't doing this, what else would you do instead? If you spend $1, you're not spending the dollar, you're spending the opportunity, you're giving up the opportunity to use that dollar in some other way. So when it comes to alcohol, can we say that using alcohol a lot is unhealthy? Absolutely. Can we say that using drugs a lot are unhealthy? Absolutely, especially depending on what kind of drugs and patterns of use. But the question that we can't study is, in your individual case or an individual person's case, what would be happening instead? Of course, I do not want anyone to be using heroin as an example. I'm picking the one that for some reason comes up as like the worst example people can come up with. Of course, I don't want anybody to be using that. That doesn't mean that we can just ignore the fact that sometimes for some people, that's the lesser of two evils, if that's what we want to call it. Regardless of those specifics, just know that whatever you're doing, if it's working for you, we want to find something better. We don't want to work on becoming more okay with the worst. In other words, the pain is a worse option than the alcohol or the drugs for you. The solution isn't to become more okay with the pain so that you don't use the alcohol or the drugs. The solution is to come up with something even better than the alcohol or the drugs, if that makes sense. And part of the cycle where people get stuck here is because of that shame and embarrassment and guilt. Just like we were talking about with the earlier question, where the fear and the anxiety itself becomes a big part of the problem, especially for people who are trying not to use whatever they're using. If I go 2 days without using it and then I use it, I'll be like, ah, dang it, I was doing pretty well. If I go 20 years without using it and then use it, I'm going to be, oh God, what's wrong with me? Even after 20 years, I through all that away. This is why we want to look at frequency, because going 20 years between relapses is better than going 2 days between relapses. There's a knee-jerk reaction to feel worse about it because you tried harder and you've made more progress. But that's only if you're focusing on that the goal is to avoid using, as opposed to the goal of being able to go longer in between, if that makes sense. I'm trying to cover a lot there without saying anything unintentionally encouraging unhealthy habits.
Brandon, I do want to bring it back to the workplace, some of these folks. So again, pain being a big anxiety. And we also have someone who has a lot of crying outbursts. And I wonder, and that she feels really affect the way her peers see her. That's scary and startling for them. And I wonder if you could also address how she may be able to use some of these peers potentially as to help her scale, to help her identify and prevent what are clearly disturbing outbursts for her.
Sure. So on the what if I experience terrible pain while I'm at work, that's a very common thing with panic attacks, separate thing from pain, right? That, well, what if I get a panic attack? Again, the worry about the worry becomes a bigger deal than the worry itself. So what you want to do is make preparations as much as possible. And you have some options theoretically, hopefully, for pain management. You want to have as much of that as accessible as possible at all times. Keep things that you can keep at your work, separate things, so you don't have to worry about bringing it back and forth. The other thing is we can try and eliminate or at least reduce the social anxiety piece of that, meaning that if part of what you're worried about, you're mentioning work specifically, right? So something about the idea of getting to that level of pain at work is worse to you than the idea of experiencing that level of pain at home. And that I'm making a lot of guesses and moving fast here, but that's likely to do with either or a combination of not having access to the things that help you, which could just be things like retreating to your bedroom and turning off the lights and sitting in a dark room, and it doesn't make the pain go away, but somehow that makes it. So there's something about the environment that makes it harder to deal with the pain, or that there's an additional social embarrassment factor of what if I feel the pain and I can't do what I'm supposed to be doing at work and my boss gets mad at me. So in that case, we want to focus as much as possible on communicating with the people that are likely to be in that environment. Obviously, the ideal would be to talk to everybody who might be around in full detail, but that's a high cost thing. You got to be safe. I mean, it's risky to talk to people about this stuff. Otherwise, you would have done it already. So you identify where it's worth taking the risk and talking to people and saying, look, this might happen. I have found, generally speaking, that some of the things that people are most embarrassed about, if they approach it and are authentic and honest about it, oftentimes people will respond better than they worry about, but there's still risk. And I don't know your boss or your situation, right? So I'm not going to say just go out there and do that, but it's worth exploring how much you might be able to do that. That if you can say something like, just so you know, if I'm doing this thing, it's not because I'm trying to avoid work or whatever, it's because I'm experiencing a pain that has flared up, or whatever, however it comes on, you know. You can even start to set up signals and systems so that if something's starting to happen, like on our scaled menu there, that your boss or your coworker or a friend or somebody who's there at work with you can start to watch for things. And if they notice something, bring it to your attention and help you out, or you can bring it there to their attention. Even trying to set up things like, if, for example, I know I just made it up, but the idea of retreating to your bedroom and turning off the lights helps. You can talk to the people at work and see if there's some way that you can set something like that up. Especially if you frame it around productivity, that I can't do what I need to do when I'm feeling this way. So either I can put all of my energy and effort into being here and pretending that I'm okay when I'm not, but I won't get anything done. And it will take a lot longer for me to kind of come out of this and get back to a place where I can do things. Or I can be honest, and we can all deal with the fact that sometimes I'm going to need to take a step away and rest so that I can recover and get back to things quickly. You know, which is more important to you, Mrs. Boss? You know, would you rather that I pretend like everything's okay, but not actually do well? Or would you rather that we all sit together and deal with the reality of it and do as best we can to get things done instead of just putting energy and effort into pretending? I talked a little bit longer about that because a lot of that applies to the person who's talking about having crying episodes as well. That again, some people are safer than others and you have to make your assessments, but you start with the people that you feel most safe with and do it one at a time so that you have an experience. If you talk to somebody and it goes well, the next time you talk to somebody is less scary. If you have the pain come up at work and it doesn't go as terribly as you're worried that it might go, the next time it'll be less scary and you'll worry about it less in between. If you're having random crying outbursts, not random, but if you're having a lot of crying outbursts, it is quite likely that you're missing signs of things building up. That's not always true. We can go from 0 to 100 in a heartbeat, but if it's happening a lot, it's likely that there are other signs that you can learn to identify that you're heading in that direction. One of the most common bad patterns I see people get into is that for whatever reason, they don't feel comfortable sharing, talking about the problem, exploring it, and it becomes shameful and embarrassing. And now they're putting so much effort into hiding it that it makes it even worse. In other words, if I think that it's a bad thing to get help, that I don't want to reveal to somebody else that I'm struggling, let them know that I'm weak or vulnerable, or that I could use their help, I can actively hide that. And different people have different abilities to do that. And, you know, other people can read it. Can we take, oh, sorry, I shouldn't read that because I'm getting distracted. We have 1 minute left. Why did I read that comment?
No,
So-
Brandon, I think that's good actually, because we do need to wrap up, and we've been asked, can we take any of these questions offline for the questions that can't get answered during this time? I don't know if Brianna or Kim, whether that was your question, but and what you feel that would look like, but we do have a lot of great questions, and it would be great to you know, be able to throw people some suggestions in some form. Kim, are you able to speak to how that would be most helpful?
Yeah, I think if people could send your questions to the email address at admin@nfnetwork.org, then we can go ahead and forward them to you, Zoe and Brendan, and thank you. And then we would love any kind of feedback that you could send. If they just put it in the chat box for us, so you can see that email address. So if you have questions that you would like looked at, we would submit them and realize that there's a limited amount of background that Brendan will have to be able to give you your answers, but I'm sure we would do the best we can to get those answers back to everybody.
Yeah, and I'll also throw out that I often do live streams that people can come and ask questions about stuff, and you can reference this and we can do that. that way. And I also do consults with people for free. If anybody just wants to book 20 minutes to talk about something, happy to meet with people.
Oh, so sweet.
Yeah, so I'm just gonna put our website in the chat as well. If you want to book a consult, you'll be sent to our contact page, and it'll come straight, your email will come straight to me, and we can make sure you get a consult, and we'll do whatever we can to get you going on the right path with the anxiety.
Yeah. And just to be clear, to reduce anxiety and make a lower barrier to entry, that's not a sales pressure thing. It's not, I don't do consults just for people who are potentially interested in becoming clients. That's just what I can do time-wise, what I can afford to do to be able to meet with people for free as much as I can. So please don't worry about whether or not you might want to be a client if you're wanting to talk.
Brendan, this is amazing. I learned so much tonight. I have every intention of listening to this again. Very, very helpful. It makes a lot of sense, but it's also really complicated. So some of these thoughts get into your mind and it feels like you need time to process. So I'm definitely going to take the information I learned tonight and process it and go back at this again another time. Your generosity with your knowledge with us tonight has been spectacular. This is obviously something that deeply concerns the NF community, and you've been a tremendous help. Very gracious to us all. Thank you very much. Thank you, Zoe. Thank you, Rosemary. What a great team. And the NF Network staff. We've got Brianna and Deb on the background helping us make sure that it's all run smoothly tonight. Thank you all very much for your participation.
And Kim, we do have people asking if they will be able to rewatch themselves. How will they be able to get the recording of this?
Okay, so that's going to happen. It's going to be uploaded onto the nfnetwork.org website. Everybody who registered, and I think I just got an update from Deb. I think there was 213 people who registered. So everybody's going to get that. They'll get an email tomorrow, whether you attended or some of the people who weren't able to attend. Everybody will get that link to the webinar, which will be on the NF Network website. You'll get tomorrow.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kim, for having us.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you all. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Always.
What a great evening. Thank you. Thank you to everybody. Yeah. Talk soon. Bye, everybody. Have a nice evening.
Bye-bye.